So this morning, as Jesus continues his trek into Jerusalem, he's teaching and he's teaching his disciples, and he's continuing to teach his Pharisees. And we're in the book of Matthew chapter 19. And he's following along. And as he continues to go, the crowds get bigger and bigger and bigger as they follow Jesus. And these Pharisees that are following Jesus, they're always lurking in the background. And they come and they confront Jesus with a question. And they aren't looking for an answer, but they're looking for an opportunity to pin Jesus down. And they want to trip Jesus up with this very sticky wicket of the issue of divorce. And so as I was going through and preparing this sermon this morning, or for this morning, it's just one of those things like, okay, do I want to preach this? Do I not want to preach this? And then the Holy Spirit said, hey, if Jesus could teach on it, then it's important enough for you to teach on it. Amen?
Amen. That's right.
And it's a tough issue. And so I'm going to try to do my best on this. And it's a hot button back then. This divorce topic was a very hot button back then as it is today. So as they're going along, they ask him this question. Everybody stops. Their ears are opened up. They're pinned back. And Jesus' words are typically very stunning to everybody. And what he applies to men here for the first time is the same absolute restrictions on divorce that had always been applied to women. And this offers women unparalleled protection from the ravages of men who, like the Pharisees, want to have their cake and eat it too. So let's get into this text and let's see what Jesus has to say about this topic. Matthew 19, verses 1 through 3. So now when Jesus had finished these things, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and as was his custom, he taught them, and he healed them there. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Okay, now since his second year of ministry, every time Jesus attracts a crowd, he also attracts these Pharisees. And they are not his disciples, understand this. They are informants, and they are obvious enemies of Jesus, these Pharisees are. And this is even more true since the Sanhedrin openly plotted to kill Jesus just not too long ago. And they put out a warrant for his arrest not more than a month ago. You can read about that back in John chapter 11. Okay? But that's what sent Jesus into this area in the first place. He's in this area that because he's trying to stay away from these murderers, these people that want to kill him, until his time has come. So he's in this area right now because of these guys. Now their question is designed to trap Jesus. Divorce was a raging debate, and it can still be a raging debate today. In fact, the Mishnah, which is the book of the Pharisees, devotes an entire chapter to divorce, and it's called the Gittin. Okay? Jesus brought the subject up in Judea a couple of months earlier here, but apparently there wasn't the opportunity to debate it back then. But now the Pharisees have finally caught up to Jesus, and they accost him with this issue again, and now there is some time for open discussion, and Jesus takes it on. The Pharisees' opinions on divorce was divided into two camps. Okay? They weren't all in agreement. One followed Hillel, and the other followed Shammai, both of whom had been dead for several decades when this happened. Now Hillel said that a man could divorce his wife if she displeased him for almost any reason at all. Alright? In fact, Akiba, who is a disciple of Hillel, he goes so far as to say that a man could divorce his wife if he found a better looking woman. Actually written down in their book. If you want to go and get the book, the Mishnah, and read it, it's in the chapter of Gittin, and it's in chapter 9, verse 10. Just saying, he wrote this down. Now Shammai, on the other hand, said that one could only divorce his wife for a serious sexual offense. Now, no matter what Jesus answers here, half the crowd is likely to be mad at Jesus. Now Shammai's view is closer to Jesus's than Hillel's, but the two are still miles apart, all right? First of all, Shammai's theology of divorce is based on Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. Now, whereas Jesus's is based on Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Jesus goes clear back to the very beginning. Second, Shammai deals with only the legal permission for men, whereas Jesus deals with the spiritual obligations of both men and women. He doesn't segregate it. And third, only Jesus places restrictions on remarriage, which the Jews would have seen as their absolute right. They figured it was their right to remarry if they divorced. Now, we should also know that this is the very issue that caused John the Baptist to lose his head. All right? They beheaded John the Baptist because of the issue of divorce. The Pharisees meet Jesus on John's old stomping ground. He's in the area where John was preaching and baptizing. So they think that if they can get Jesus to say the same thing that John did, that perhaps Jesus will fall to the same fate of his predecessor. They figure if Jesus says the same thing John does, that Herod or somebody will capture him and they'll kill him. And this would please the Pharisees very much. Let's continue with the text, verses 4 through 6. And he answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Now, we know that Jesus never backed down from a good fight, right? We also know he wasn't scared. And they challenged him with the most difficult and touchy issue, and he jumps in feet first, fists up, ready to go. Now, his opening retort, haven't you read? He said that. Now, we see that. That's not a big deal. But to these guys, this would have been a slap in the face, and it would have been very offensive to these Bible scholars, because they not only just read, but they memorized the Torah. So when he says, have you not read this? It's like, well, yeah, duh. And so he slaps them right in the face and gets their attention. Now, their theology of divorce is based on the hagglings of oral tradition grounded in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4, as I mentioned. But Jesus, with typical clarity, goes clear back to the beginning and God's design for man and woman. First, he states that God designed a man and a woman to be married to each other. And he's citing Genesis 1:27. And they belong together physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Now, second, the marriage bond involves two things. It involves leaving and cleaving. Genesis 2:24 is where that comes from. Now, leaving father and mother in the biblical word was not necessarily setting up a separate household. In fact, that would have been a rare thing in those days of the patriarchs. You see, rather leaving meant changing your primary commitments. Mom and dad no longer receive primary loyalty. That went to each other. Okay? The second part of the marriage bond involves becoming one flesh. And although this is not exclusively sexual intercourse, there is no greater picture of physical union than this. Okay? Thus, marriage is a picture of a covenant. If you go to Proverbs 2:17, which stands on two pillars. Marriage stands on two pillars. One is commitment, and the second one is oneness, or an intimate faithfulness. If either of these two is destroyed, the marriage breaks down. All right? Now, based on these two pillars, God, he joins a couple together, and the word that Jesus uses is to mean to be yoked together. They're yoked together, thus they become life partners and co-laborers. And this is God's design from the garden. This is how he designed man and woman. This is how he designed marriage. It's not particularly Jewish or Christian. All right? This is human. He designed this. This is the human way. It's not Jewish or Christian. This is God's creation ordinance. He created it this way. One man with one woman for life. That was his intent. Let's continue with the text. Verses 7 through 8. And they said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and send her away? And he said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. So the Pharisees debated the meaning of Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4, but they mishandled the text. All right? For starters, Moses did not command that a man divorce his wife. Rather, he forbade a man from marrying the same woman twice. Okay? This was primarily for the protection of the woman. Now, in such a male-dominated society, women were treated as property, which is wrong. And this law would keep a man from too quickly dismissing his wife just because they got into a fight. All right? If he lets her go, it's for keeps. It's permanent. That's the way it was supposed to be. He can't snatch her back like a child swapping baseball cards. Oh, well, we got bad news yesterday, but it's a month later, and now I think I love her, so I want her back. And then she burnt the toast, so now I'm wanting gone with her again, and then she wants her back. No, Moses says, no, once you do this, it's it. It's for keeps. So the primary question in the debate with Hillel versus Shammai creates this meaning of what is something indecent? All right? Because Hillel says for anything, Shammai says it's for something that's indecent. And literally, it means nakedness or exposure, specifically of the genitals, and most often in reference to women. All right? But it probably does not refer merely to adultery, for the law prescribed the death penalty for adultery. If you go back to Leviticus 20 and Deuteronomy 22, so if you committed adultery, you were to be killed. One hardly needs to divorce a dead woman, right? If you're dead, you don't need a divorce. So, and even though the Jews seldom executed people for adultery, and especially in the New Testament times they didn't, it would be rather incongruous for Moses to establish such a double standard within the written law itself. But on the other hand, something indecent certainly must mean more than being ugly or being a bad cook. Right? Because that was Hillel's section. And the Hillelites, say that 10 times fast, they applied it that way. I don't care what it is. If you don't like it, you can divorce your wife. And it seems reasonable to assume that something indecent covers a range of sexual sins, including adultery. And this would be true for both the Hebrew word and Jesus' application of that word, translated with the Greek word meaning porneia. Okay? Thus, a serious sexual sin breaks the one flesh pillar of the marriage covenant. So we're talking about something that's breaking down one of the two pillars that holds up the covenant of marriage. Now let's get back to the Pharisees' question. Although Moses did not command divorce, his regulations did de facto permit it to happen. Now Moses is not advocating divorce. He's not promoting it, he's not advocating it. Rather, he is regulating it. All right? He can't stop it, but he can put some parameters on it. And without legal guidelines, women and children were especially vulnerable to the ravages of what Jesus called their hard hearts. So, you can't just say that Moses commanded men to get a divorce. That's not it. Let's continue on with some of the scriptures. Matthew 19:9 says, and Jesus says, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery," and Mark puts, "against her." Mark 10:12 says, "And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." And Luke 16, verse 18b says, "And he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery." All right. This is a pretty difficult text, and it's for a number of reasons. This is difficult for a number of reasons, but before dealing with this text itself, we ought to set some parameters around the explanation of this text. We're going to break this down. First, this is a debate between Jesus and the Pharisees. All right, we have to understand that he's debating with the Pharisees here. And the question is designed to trap Jesus, is especially about a husband divorcing a wife. Therefore, we should probably be cautious about making universal absolutes from the narrative as we are with other debate texts. Okay? We can't make these things absolute truth just because this is what Jesus said. He's debating with somebody here. We have to understand that. We have to put this in context. All right? Secondly, when Matthew writes this, all right, the ink is hardly dry from Matthew 18, verses 18 through 35, which is dealing with an erring brother and confronting an unrepentant brother. Remember about forgiving somebody that sins against me 7 times and 7 times in a day? He's just written this. Matthew has. All right? Divorce, although a highly personal issue, must not be dealt with alone. Okay? Here's the deal. Christians are a part of a body, a larger body. Therefore, a couple heading towards divorce have an obligation to seek counsel and support from the broader Christian fellowship which they're joined to. Matthew's going to go back to say, okay, if somebody sins against you, you take them to the church. And then if they sin, then you kick them out of the church. Remember that whole process? Now, we've got two people that are at odds with each other. Why do we treat that any differently? Let's take it before the church. And third, we must balance both solid clarification and realistic application. Although the text must reign supreme over our opinions, our reasons, and our culture, any explanation of this text which leads to oppression, which leads to bigotry or legalism should be suspect. If your intent is to oppress somebody or add bigotry to somebody or legalization by using this text, I would say that they're using it incorrectly. That's not the intent. It's our job not only to explain the text accurately, and that being said, the verse confronts us with two major questions. The first question: is Jesus given permission to divorce if your spouse is unfaithful? That's the question. Some would say no, absolutely not. This exception clause is found only in Matthew 5:32 and 19:9. Now some suggest that Matthew would not contain an exception clause, which Mark and Luke didn't, because then Matthew's recipients would be allowed to divorce, but Luke's and Mark's audience would not. Okay, there's something to say that he wouldn't say it because it gives them permission, but these guys, it wouldn't give them permission. Make sense? So, however, among the Greeks and the Romans, and this is who Mark and Luke were primarily writing to, it was universally assumed that adultery was adequate grounds for divorce. So, it just went without saying. So, in other words, that Matthew explicitly states what Mark and Luke assume. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So, furthermore, if we look closely at Matthew 5:32, it doesn't actually say that adultery is permission for divorce. It merely says that if a man divorces his wife, he forces her to become an adulteress. Unless, of course, she had already been involved in adultery. All right? In other words, if she is already an adulteress, you can't make her an adulteress again. She's already an adulteress. Now that logic works well for Matthew 5:32, but it doesn't hold true for Matthew 19:9. Here, it is the man who commits adultery by divorcing his wife. Now you see, the Pharisees were wanting to tag all this on the woman. And Jesus is saying, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And they're probably not liking this. Now based on this, we can confidently say that Jesus grants permission without obligation to divorce an unfaithful spouse. But just what exactly is unfaithfulness? Again, we have to break it down. Now the word used in Matthew 5:32 and 19:9 is what I said earlier, is porneia. And it at least means adultery, but it may mean more. Like its Old Testament counterpart, erva, which is used in Deuteronomy 24:1, porneia can cover a range of sexual sins, not just adultery. This could include coitus, indecent exposure, homosexuality, molestation, incest. Okay, anything that would be sexually permissive could mean this unfaithfulness. But it would have to be at such a serious nature as to breach the oneness of the marital covenant. It has to break that oneness covenant. You understand? But is sexual infidelity the only reason for divorce? That's another question. Some people will tell you that sexual infidelity is the only reason. And the question is it? And the answer is no. Okay? Paul clearly adds another one in 1 Corinthians 7:17. It's an unbelieving spouse abandons a Christian. The believer is to let him or her go. Alright? And if a Christian is abandoned by a fellow believer, however, she or he is to remain celibate and strive for reconciliation. 1 Corinthians 7:11. Now one might assume that Christians abandoned by a non-believer should also remain celibate. 1 Corinthians 7:8. Unless the sexual temptation is too great to withstand. 1 Corinthians 7:9. And obviously a second marriage is preferable to fornication. You can't stay single and go out there and do everything that your little heart desires sexually and say that it's okay. All right? It's better to remain celibate. And if you can't remain celibate, then it's better to be remarried. Paul states this. Now, in conclusion, there are two valid reasons for divorce. One, sexual unfaithfulness, which destroys the first pillar of the marriage covenant, which is oneness. And secondly, abandonment by an unbelieving spouse, which destroys the second pillar of marriage, which is commitment. Are there any other instances in which Jesus would approve of divorce based on other than abandonment or adultery? Okay? Now, some confidently say, yes, there is. If there are, however, it would have to be serious enough to irreparably damage one of the two pillars of the marriage covenant. You have to go back to how God established the marriage covenant. If the reason why you're wanting to get divorced is it breaks either one of those two, then it's going to be one of those things that's acceptable. Now, there's a lot of people that suggest a lot of ideas. Big one. Physical abuse. All right? Sexual deviancy. Insanity. All right? Alzheimer's. Extended comatose. Alcoholism or drug abuse. You see, there's a lot of reasons why people want to get divorced from their spouse. A lot of the things might fall into this category. But we need to be very cautious here. While recognizing that neither Jesus nor Paul's discussions are designed to handle all the complexities and possibilities of divorce, they do set God's parameters on this issue. On the one hand, we must be faithful with what the Scripture teaches. On the other hand, we must apply this teaching with sensitivity, compassion, and reason. Okay? On the other, and so based on the context of Matthew 18, 15 through 35, we offer this caution against dealing too lightly with divorce. I think sometimes we take it too lightly and we don't go back to the biblical principles. Although there may be more valid reasons for divorce than the two mentioned by Jesus and Paul, that is not an individual decision. Again, it's not an individual decision. When a couple is experiencing marital difficulty, they have an obligation to the body to seek counsel and prayer. Most people want to say, mind your own business, but you're part of a larger body. Okay? A couple embroiled in a conflict will almost invariably magnify their problems or their problem and too quickly conclude that their differences are irreconcilable. I mean, you're mad. This is not going to come to, we're not going to be able to reconcile this at all. At that point, all right, godly Christian leaders are probably able to make better decisions than the couple is. All right? Now, understand what defines it. Godly Christian leaders, all right? Not people that want to put their nose in everybody's business or think that they're smarter than everybody. They're going to take that advice from the Holy Spirit. Since divorce affects the whole body, it hardly seems right for it to be a private decision.